So, welcome. This is Society, Robots and Us. Our topic is hiring for inclusive workforce. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Kay Siegel, who is with the University of Toronto Robotics, Nicholas Nadeau, who's with Halliday Robotics and currently is also in Canada, in Montreal, by Kerry Fetzer-Borelli, who's with Toyota Research Institute and is currently in Boston. And both Kelly and Kerry are on the board of Women in Robotics. And Kerry, you're also on the Allies Committee for Black in Robotics as well. And of course, Ken Goldberg, artist and roboticist from Citrus People and Robots Group at UC Berkeley. And Ken is chairing the Black in Robotics Allies Committee as well, as was one of the co-founders of the African Robotics Network, which is something that I hope we'll see more of in the future. And let me just start with an acknowledgement that I'm here on the lands of the Mwukma Ohlone peoples, who are an unrecognized American Indigenous peoples. And in fact, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands everywhere where we're participating, and I hope that we can do more to be more inclusive of traditional owners of the land when it comes to the practice of robotics. We want to blend together the technologies of the future with the experience and wisdom of traditional custodians. And this is perhaps one of the first points where we can discuss what is inclusivity in robotics, not from the end user of the robot perspective, but from the who are the people in the company? Who makes the robots? Who's got a voice in the design, in the building? Who participates in that process? And indeed, I'm Andrew Kay, Managing Director of Silicon Valley Robotics and visiting scholar at Citrus People and Robots Group. I'm one of the founders of the Women in Robotics community. We founded Women in Robotics to support women who were working in robotics and women who wanted to work in robotics. And of course, now we've extended that definition to be women and non-binary people, which I think is important to acknowledge. At the same time, it's been important for us to say it's necessary for us to have a community, because our experiences of the robotics industry are different. And it makes a great difference in our success career-wise when we have the support of other women. And now what we wanted to do is look a little bit further and say, what are the things that we can do to increase the inclusivity of hiring in robotics? And we're going to start with Kerry Fetzer-Borelli, and each of our speakers is going to have, well, let's call it 5 minutes, but as long as they need to share their stories and their thoughts about the practice. And we will pass the mic from speaker to speaker. And if you have questions or comments, please put them into the chat, initially speaking, and then we'll open for general discussion. So Kerry, would you like to lead the way?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Sandra. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. My name is Kerry Fetzer-Borelli. I use she or they pronouns. I'm the head of DEI and community engagement at Toyota Research Institute. And my background is in prototyping and robotics operations. I'm also a journeyman iron worker and welder. I used to weld for the nuclear power industry. So I have a kind of non-traditional path of getting into the robotics world. But it's been just a pleasure, a really great journey. So thinking about inclusive hiring for really any field, but specifically for STEM, it's a really great topic. I'm glad we're all going to be talking about it. I'm going to try not to say too much here at the top and make sure we all get to introduce ourselves, but I think a lot of what we're learning is that we have to really consider history and the impacts of the histories of oppression when we think about things that we might need to change about the systems we use today in order to include more humans, right? More perspectives. So some of the things that we've been doing at Toyota Research Institute that are kind of new to us, at least some of them are, and we're working on measuring the impacts, right? We need to make sure that our intentions, that the impact matches the intention of what we did. But things like, blind resumes, trying to remove some of these unconscious biases that all of us have within us by taking away school names, the names of the people on the resumes, trying to give a fair playing field, using inclusive language in job descriptions, making sure our hiring panels are diverse, unconscious bias training for our hiring managers, making sure that they understand and learn to recognize and mitigate their own unconscious biases. All of us have them. So we're really wanting to normalize the conversation about this, being able to talk about it. And another thing that I think is really important is that it really just doesn't end at the point where you've gotten through the interview and you've been hired. You have to be able to exist in this space and expect that you have equity there, right? That you have the same advantages as everyone else. So making sure that benefits are equitable, that there are career development opportunities, that employee resource groups are funded and supported and really allowed to act as a collective voice that's taken seriously. All of these things are just hugely important in maintaining inclusivity. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Andrea.
You've given us a really good list of topics to get started with. Thank you, Kerry. I've taken some notes because I don't want to lose so many of these topics, but I think one of the hardest things about addressing inclusivity is that it's a multi-threaded set of potential solutions, and they have to all be applied. There isn't a single silver bullet. Nicholas, you are working with Halliday Robotics, which is a very cool company, originally out of Europe and now expanding in Canada and the US. And, I also want to ask you a little bit about the Halliday humanoid robot Eve, as well as about inclusivity practices at Halliday. And so over to you, Nicholas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I guess let's start with, they don't teach this topic in school. I'm going to approach this very much from a pure engineering hiring manager perspective. So I'm fortunate enough to have a partner who works at the Office for Students with Disabilities at McGill University. And most of my education, I'd say, is definitely thanks to her and allowing me to really see the bigger picture through diversity and inclusivity. And so like the perspective I'm taking is, if we're building a product to change the world, we need to really ensure that the world is represented in our product and the people building it. We want Eve and the future generations of the robot to really make an impact on the world. And it's just little things like discovering through product management sessions that, hey, maybe we should use computer vision to recognize ASL and actually communicate back with the arms and gestures and things like that. That there are opportunities that you wouldn't necessarily discover through just standard engineering meetings, that these are approaches that you should take for a more better product that can have an impact. On the flip side of that is, I'm not a big fan of approaching it from like radical solutions. I don't think there is a magic pill that will dramatically solve that. I'm very much a 1% guy. What little increments can we make? Take this from a very engineering perspective, just to make it better step by step. And so from my work, I've really been trying to focus on 3 major areas: better hiring practices, and Kerry stole all my good ideas, some better mentorship and growth opportunities, and really community engagement is also a big one. So on the hiring side of things, one thing I've definitely been spending a lot of my time on these past few years, jumping from startup to startup and growing companies, especially through their seed rounds to Series A, is the hiring. There's no better feeling than finding that next awesome person who will be part of your team, but the process itself is terrible for everyone involved. There's hundreds of CVs to review, many of which aren't relevant, unfortunately. Scheduling interviews is a logistical nightmare. Job descriptions are never good enough and are never really targeted or well written to really include the right people or even find the person you were hoping to find. And from a candidate's perspective, they're often kept in the dark throughout this entire process. And so they're not having a good experience, and often the hiring manager isn't having a good experience either. And what a lot of people don't know, especially at the startup stage, is we often don't have HR or recruitment teams for doing this. It's the technical engineers, the devs, the leadership team that are trying to balance day-to-day operations and fires with filling the team so that we can achieve that next product, that next milestone, the next success. And so this mix, so this rush, this fire, this often falling into the trap of hiring the first best person that comes your way does not help the process at all. And success isn't just about filling in the ranks and finding that person. We need to, as Carrie mentioned, make them successful in their role. It's not just on the incoming of the funnel, it's throughout the entire process, throughout their entire career at the company. And I find it's especially difficult when trying to find senior candidates or team leadership, because this exclusion process, that bias that filters out the good people, has already taken effect over many years. And so I find a lot more diversity in junior candidates. But then the flip side is, how can we make these junior candidates successful if they don't have leaders they could look up to and really identify with? Or we can't necessarily attract these junior candidates in diversity if we don't have leadership that is diverse in itself. And so it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem that we sometimes fall into. So those are a lot of the issues I face day to day. So some of the solutions I've been trying to target really focus around how can we make it better from a process point of view. If we want to be world-class, we need to start acting like we're world-class. And so we need to promote our company's culture and experience from day one. And when especially in funded companies, like to take the approach of paying someone else to make it happen because I'm not the expert. So for instance, I work with a Canadian company called Pivot and Edge, which I contract out to build my recruitment infrastructure so that everyone has a fair and well-defined interview process. So it doesn't just fall on the shoulders of overworked developers and leadership team people. And through this, we can ensure that we have standardized evaluations, consistent feedback loops that keep our candidates up to date and in the loop, well-defined job descriptions that aren't written over a weekend or late at night and just trying to get out there what we think we want, really to connect back to our core values. We really try to use an interview process that includes an inclusive team, and especially the team that they'll be working with, so that there's buy-in from the team of who their next partner is, but also that the candidate really knows who they will be working with on the other end. And so this leads to some forms of like empowerment in the growth process for both the candidate and for the people as part of the team. Sorry about that. So job descriptions, as Carrie mentioned, is a really big topic. You are completely right on everything about using inclusive language and things like that. One big topic I've found, or one big focus, is to make them shorter, make them more concise. Focus on outcomes, not a massive list of requirements. I find that requirements are often a big barrier to diversity. Many people feel discouraged from applying when there's just an overwhelming list of you need all these qualifications. There's a statistic that I've seen that says like men apply when they only need 60% of the requirements, and then women need to hit all 100% to feel like they can apply. And so these like overzealous requirements are a barrier to diversity, especially for people who haven't had the opportunity or the privilege to have access to those requirements and those opportunities. And so we really like to take an approach where we focus on the outcomes. What do we see as success in this role? And are you the right person who can achieve that success? Not necessarily just because you had a degree from the specific university, use the specific tool and the specific application. Often that doesn't necessarily matter when rubber hits the road and you're doing the day-to-day work. It's the person and their capacity to fill that role and achieve the outcomes. On recently, a big push we've been trying to pivot around, working with our recruitment consultants, is employer value. And so our employer value proposition and our employer brand, and really sitting down and identifying who we are as an employer and what values are we interviewing for and what values do we want to grow into. Are the people who we're working with and want to work with financially motivated? Are they looking for prestige? Do they only want a 300K salary, work at a FANG company in Silicon Valley? Or do they want to work on the next great product with great people no matter where in the world? And so we're trying to hire for value fit more than just our current culture fit, and really trying to bring our culture towards those values. And those values connect directly to our product. We've discovered through internal interviews with our current team members and that our values are focused around innovation. So I want to work on cutting edge technology and make the world a better place. Performance, I want to work with the best people and be the best that I can be. And teamwork, so I want to work with a diverse and close-knit team. And so with this, we can pivot our hiring process to hopefully more objectively interview based on these values rather than biased gut feeling checks or the famous beer test. And so this hopefully leads us to a more objective evaluation. I'm in Canada, trying to start up the Montreal headquarters for a Norwegian-based robotics company. We have people in Brazil, the UK, India, Japan, China, and Dallas as of last week. And so we're trying to create like a hub and spoke model to reach the best people no matter where they're located. And hopefully this hybrid model also accounts for not everyone wants to move or has the capacity to move to Oslo or to move to Montreal. It's up to us as employers to make them successful no matter where they are. And hopefully this does good for our people and can account for people where relocation might be an issue, where they have a family or they can't necessarily just pick up their roots and move away. Maybe a hybrid at-home work model can help with childcare or other family situations that they might be the greatest worker in the world, and we want them no matter what that situation might be. So that's the hiring part in a bit of a nutshell. On the community engagement part, I've been really enjoying these SVR talks these past few weeks with you. So thank you very much for including me. And that's why I love like webinars and conferences and meetups. And I believe like being part of the ecosystem and community allows us to engage in reality and not stay siloed in our pure development and our pure engineering world. And so this is where I almost see like diversity starts to become inclusion, is where we actually engage with the community and have that feedback loop. I like to look for talent in non-traditional locations. Like last year, working with another Canadian organization, VanHack, recruitment group, that we went down to South America to find developers and relocate them back to Canada with their families to give them opportunities that they couldn't necessarily find locally. And so this is a win-win situation because they got to have an opportunity that they wouldn't have necessarily had down there, while we got to bring diversity and new people into our workforce and really expand, not just hiring in Montreal, for instance. Halodi Robotics, for instance, has had great success hiring at robotics conferences, using that like international academic melting pot as a source of diverse talent. One fun story is one of our lead software developers is Dutch, met the Norwegian co-founders in Canada, moved to Norway, and now his American wife is our VP of supply chain. And so trying to get that diversity through referrals and through families and that connection. Our employer brand is more than just a few words on our website. We really believe that it's about the people, the lives they built, and the stories we want to build with them as part of our team. And so I guess the last topic is growth opportunities, making room, making people successful, making sure they have a voice in the room is definitely a big part of that. As I hinted before, there's a bit of a supply and demand problem, especially at the senior talent level, when that exclusion process has already taken place in the market and we just don't have the supply even though we want it. And so what I'm trying to do now is build an internship program. So get people foot in the door and create a new source of talent that doesn't depend on the existing institutions. and really put the resources there so that we don't just take a build it and they will come approach, where if we open positions, obviously people will want to join us. We have to do some effort to open up the funnel a bit. So that's one thing I'd like to discuss during the Q&A session later on is what a good internship program look like? What do people want in a company? What kind of projects would they want to work on? And what would make them successful and be a company that they would want to work for? And this feedback loop, I'm hoping, will educate us and hopefully enlighten the people that even though we want diversity, it's not always easy just to make diversity happen.
I don't think it's ever easy making diversity happen. And I'm really pleased you raised the issues of culture, because unless you make culture explicit, culture is, I feel comfortable with these people. And so it tends to be people who are very similar rather than people that have diversity. And yet that doesn't mean that people with great diversity don't fit explicit values and aren't going to be the best for a company. But those are the reasons why we get into trouble, because small companies, as you mentioned, don't have HR, don't have time, and they hire based on their gut feelings, people that they know in their network, or people that they feel comfortable with, or people that pattern match the same skill set that already exists in the founding team. Then we end up with the fantastic phrase for this, the diversity debt, because the worse your diversity is at the start, the greater your debt accumulates as you grow. It's much, much harder to address lack of diversity in a company with 300 people or 3,000 people than it is to start talking about it when you have 13 people. You know, ideally, you've already dealt with diversity, but I see many robotics companies that have zero diversity. And if we were to go with the number, just in terms of women in robotics, of 1 woman in 20, then that's not evenly distributed. There isn't, 1 woman for every 20 people in all robotics companies. Quite the opposite. What we find is that companies that had a focus of diversity early, that had women in their founding team, have many women in their companies. And other companies grow and grow and come to me saying, Andra, we really want to hire more diversely, but we just don't seem to be able to. And, they've already accrued diversity debt that they're having trouble understanding even how to progress beyond that. You raised many, many really good points, Nicholas. And I'm also really pleased that you raised geographic inclusivity. And, the pandemic has made us realize how it is possible to work in a distributed fashion. And I think it is going to be a real challenge for us moving forwards to embrace the best practices of hybrid work models. I mean, it's not necessarily good for women with children to be working from home while they're balancing looking after their children at the same time. But at the same time, I know as a mother that having flexible hours was a huge contributor to me being able to work at all. And in fact, Hallie, I'd love to hear from you now. You have experience as a mother, and you have experience right now with the University of Toronto Robotics Group. And you're going to broaden this discussion a little bit so that we're going to talk about hiring from an academic perspective, and also potentially the admissions process, as well as the broader philosophy of inclusivity for robotics. So over to you, Hallie Siegel.
Thanks so much, Andra, for organizing the conversation. And I feel like we've touched on so many different aspects. Would you guys mind if I shared the screen? Is that doable, Andra?
Oh, it should be doable. And
let me just do that quickly. Can you see at this point? There we go.
Oh, yes, we can. It's happening now. Leverage points places to intervene in the system.
Yeah, so I think, Nicholas, you said I'm taking an engineering perspective, and U of T employs about 20,000 people, and that is, so we're a much bigger organization, of course. The University of Toronto Robotics Institute is a very new organization within a very old organization. And as Andrea said before, the culture of the whole place, of course, impacts where we are. I thought it would be useful to use Donatella Meadows, who's a really well-known systems thinker, for talking about the topic. She talks about leverage points, places to intervene in a system, where it is you can affect system change. And there's a spectrum, and at the low end, you can twiddle with the numbers. You can, add quotas or subsidies in an HR context, for example. You can also talk about the stocks and flows, like who's actually in your HR pipeline. So who are the people flowing through your HR system. I heard Nicholas talk about feedback loops. There are positive feedback loops and negative ones. You can have complaint processes. You can have recognition awards. There are many ways to tweak that, I think. Donatella also talks about delays. So I think of that in an HR context almost as maybe the time it takes to build seniority as people move through your system. And of course, there's information flows, like, are we collecting diversity data? Are we reporting that? And then what are the rules or constraints? Like I have, whether it's, incentives that are in place in order to hire. And then, of course, distribution of power. So who's making the decisions, who's sitting on the board, who's in holding financial control. And then we can talk more broadly about the system goals. So whether that's at the micro level, like what's the job description of the job as a system, or is it of the organization? Do we have a diversity mission? Is it actually part of our goals in organization to have diverse thinking, and not just, for instance, as a university, to do the standard, training and research? And then, of course, as Andrew spoke very passionately about before, is also the culture. Like, what's the system mindset? Do we employ diversity thinking? Is it part of our organizational wide culture? And of course, these things are easier to tinker with at the one end, and much harder and takes longer to implement at the other. But of course, the impact is, I think, bigger. And this is the point of Donatella's paper. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet. If you're looking at anything systemic and want to do any kind of system level change. I'm relatively new to U of T and also to all of its practices and policies, but we're in the process of building our own within the Institute. And of course, so I took this as a learning opportunity to learn about, well, what is U of T doing and how is it implemented equitable hiring practices and inclusive hiring practices at the university-wide level. So really sort of brief history. Back in 2016, the university probably took its first sort of more official recognized step with offering a paid HR diversity internship. But things really have kind of ballooned and expanded. This is just a tiny little collection of some of the things that have been happening within the Faculty of Engineering in particular. In 2018, the HR, I'll note that it's also called the HR and Equity Department, not just the HR department. And I think these names kind of matter. But it created a mandate for diverse hiring with a focus on underrepresented groups. So that was 3 years ago now. Since then, a couple of things have happened. In 2019, there was an independent review of anti-Black racism at U of T that was started. And in fact, that report just came out and the university agreed to follow all, I think there were 56 recommendations that were made by that independent review panel. Also in 2019, the university hired a director of equity, diversity, and inclusion and appointed them to oversee all EDI within divisions. There was also, they've been surveying, collecting data, and compared to 2017, when they started collecting the data in 2019, And I'm not sure what the latest data is, so apologize for that, but they are measuring and starting to see an increase in, you know, the stocks. So you can't expect, I guess the point of all of this is, you know, we're starting to see some lift in and actual progress, but often starting down here isn't really where you see change. And I think what has been interesting to me to observe at the university is really how there are multiple things that are happening across the system to try to address change. And of course, in many ways, lots of progress has been made. I think, you know, on a couple of fronts. First of all, half the deans, I think, at U of T are females. So this is something that's very, you know, big change that has happened over a number of years, of course. But in terms of role modeling, this is very positive role modeling for, especially when we see this, of course, in the STEM subjects as well. We also see just interpersonally, a lot of men are advocating for female hires. And so I think that the mindset is starting to change, and we see this a lot. And I've got a thunderstorm just popped up, so excuse me for the noise. But, you know, not everything is perfect. Of course, there's still so much progress to make. You know, we have a lot of female faculty, for instance, in computer science at U of T, but the majority, there are a lot more of them on the teaching stream than in the research stream. So if we talk again about the distribution of power and who holds the financial and decision-making power, it's often with the research faculty. So we know progress does need to be made there. You know, you also, Andrew, were talking about a deficit. Like, do you start with a deficit or do you start with, you know, in the green? When we launched our institute, there was an early mandate for representation across the faculty and the divisions, but at the moment we also have like half of our directorship are women for the Robotics Institute, and just under a quarter of our core faculty are women in the institute as well, which I think for the field of robotics, which is very male driven, it's not a bad representation in terms of gender. We need to be doing a lot better when we get into racialized groups. And so, you know, there's lots of areas where we could be making more progress, but, you know, I guess what I'm hoping is that as we put into place more things like our, you know, surveys and reporting structures around these things, that people become more aware and the change sort of naturally starts to unfold. But no doubt these things take time, and you have to start early, or as early as you can. So that's it from me.
Thank you, Hallie. That's a really interesting systems thinking perspective on this as well. And many interesting solutions develop when you hear from people that have really thought about the whole system. As an Australian who came over here, I know one of the things that has worked in Australia was introducing board quotas. And that put a lot of senior women forward. Now, it's not saying that there weren't senior women before, but they weren't recognized in the same way. And the pool of candidates that you have to choose from became much greater as more women had board experience. And in fact, to the point that Nicholas raised about the difficulties with, for example, underrepresented groups like African Americans, seeing people, similar people in senior positions, when there is such a small percentage, we're just reaching a stage where, even though women are frequently not in senior positions, or particularly in corporations, that we can hear stories like the one that Hallie's just shared, where a significant percentage, very significant percentage of senior management is female. And I'm just thinking, if we focus on diversity at a board level, then it's possible for one person to have several board positions. So we can perhaps have a multiplier effect in that way to see more underrepresented people in senior positions where we know we have a great vacuum in the next step down. So, you know, we potentially have opportunities to address this in such a range of ways. Kerry and Nicholas, I'm sure, you know, you raised the topic of internships as well, but I'd love to hear from Ken, because Ken deals with this in both from his own personal experience and from experience academically and his work with startups. So Ken, over to you.
Well, thank you, Andra. I have to say, I find this really interesting and important conversation because it's come up in my own lab, where I have 3 of my top students are graduating, women students who are graduating, and as we're recruiting, I wasn't able to get the students I actively recruited did not accept; they went elsewhere. So I have this big imbalance all of a sudden, and so I've been talking with the women who are still in the lab and trying to think, is there anything I did wrong? Is there anything we can improve? And it's really been helpful. They've been very reassuring. But now we're talking to the Society of Women Engineers, and we're going to do some outreach, and essentially that's why I'm asking these questions about recruiting. And I also, so I'm interested in this from a lab. From a researcher's point of view in a university, but I'm also interested in it because we have a startup company, and this is a startup with 5 founders who are all white men, and and it wasn't by any intention or we all really want to diversify, but right now we're faced with they're hiring, and it's a big challenge. And I think Andra raised some really good points about how do you create the workforce and the environment that's going to really be receptive and appealing for diverse groups to join. So I'm curious how others feel about that, because I think it's chicken and egg, right? If you don't have that critical mass, as you guys were saying, then it's hard to get there. And so what steps could a smaller organization like a lab or a startup take to move the ball forward? Because we're very interested in work in fixing this and addressing it, and sustainably, by the way, which is not just to hire some people now, but I want to create a pipeline that continues to build over the next decades. So any advice on those questions? I'm curious.
Well, I'd love to hear from Kerry and Hallie and Nicholas, and I'm sure there are other suggestions. I just want to chime in first. I told you you're not going to keep me quiet on this subject. In understanding the power of veto and the role that that plays, because one of the things that happens in the hiring process is that you have many stages that people are going through. But as long as somebody has the power to veto, and this might not be explicit, but as long as you're looking for consensus around who passes through to the next stage, then you do de facto give somebody the power of veto. And we know that historically, it is very difficult for diversity candidates to make it through that stage. You can get them into the pipeline, and you go to all this trouble to get them into the pipeline, and then they never make it through into the final selection. And it turns out, when you reverse engineer, this is because somebody somewhere got to say, I'm not sure that they're the best candidate. And that overwhelms the impact of every other step that you've taken to improve the flow. And I think, factoring that into the processes is a very important thing to do. And the other thing that I loved that Nicholas was bringing up, and Kerry as well, is thinking about how to retain. So offering more than just the job that you get when you walk through the door, but talking about how that is going to develop with you, how that's going to grow with you, and how you are going to be able to reach your potential with the support of everybody. I think we need to be looking at this holistically. Now, Kerry, sorry, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Ken, what brought to mind, I'm just thinking about networking, right? I think Nicholas talked about this a little bit too. We all tend to sort of go to the pools of humans that we know or that we're connected with. And we do have to really meet people where they are, right? So I think a lot of it is relationship building, and also what are you willing to hold yourself accountable for? I saw Sarah in the comments making some really good comments. And especially, you know, few women want to be the first female in the team, right? But what if you could commit to something for this person? You know, I think it's really difficult to come into any space and be the only one and have no real guarantee that you're not just going to be the only one fighting for there to be another one in who knows how many months. But if you can set a goal and hold yourself accountable to that, you might be able to make a more convincing offer. In addition to, of course, you know, inclusive benefits, whatever else you're doing inside of your startup that you can offer that takes into account the perspective of this human that you're trying to bring into this space.
That's really thoughtful, Kerry. I mean, no one wants to be a diversity hire either. I mean, we all want to be appreciated for our unique qualities that we bring to a role. So it is a little chicken and egg. And I think you offered fantastic suggestions there. And now, Nicholas, I'm sure you had some suggestions too, and Hallie. So first to you, Nicholas.
So Sarah in the chat there is really winning with the comments. It's 0 to 1 is probably the hardest transition, and it only gets easier as it goes along. We actually, so part of our whole employer brand and value proposition work that we're trying to do is we're trying to actually do public content that we're putting out to give a bit of a day in the life of what's it like to be an engineer at the company, what's it like to be this person, what's our core technology. You know, it's a bit of marketing from the recruiting side. But one of our best pieces we put out last month for Women's Appreciation Month was the story of Casey, our VP of supply chain, who started off as a temp, worked her way through R&D project manager, and now is VP of supply chain, and is also part of the leadership team and the exec team, and showing that growth. And just through that posting, we saw amazing incoming candidates start to pop up in our funnel that we never found before, and lots of conversations start. And it's about being public and very transparent, and it's a two-way street with your future talent pool, and making sure they understand what your culture is and that you understand what they're looking for.
Excellent. And I love the comments that are coming up. Sarah, fantastic comments. Charlotte, you talk about culture as well, and about how it's easy to feel that the culture is going to default to a poor culture unless it's made explicit, as we were talking about before. And Jill, great suggestions about, you know, where do you go? Ditto Sarah, for example, women in robotics, and Jill's suggesting Society of Women Engineers and alumni of the fantastic robotics competitions that have done a very, very good job of increasing diversity within robotics. By now, there are a lot of adults that I talk to in robotics companies that got their first taste of robotics through the competitions. And even if robotics isn't the, how do you say, the disciplines that they chose to study, it's the experience that has left them passionately interested in the work that robotics does. Hallie, over to you.
Yeah, so many interesting points have been raised. You know, Andrew, you were talking about like getting into the pipeline in the first place, and universities are really in the business of building talent pipelines. Like that's the job that they do. They create the talent pool. And so they have a really important role effectively as gatekeepers into this whole community. And I won't say that everybody who gets into the robotics industry necessarily goes through a university training program, but a lot of them do. And especially at the sort of more influential end of the pipeline, we're looking at very highly educated people And I think, you know, universities are in a really interesting place because I think they both have the opportunity to really broaden the talent pool and the diversity in the talent pool. And at the same time, you know, so many universities are, you know, there's the prestige factor, and well, we, you know, so many people are applying to get in, and we only look at people with this GPA or with this type of level of test score before they even get through the interview through to an interview. And I think those kinds of things can, you know, it does have the potential unfortunate effect of shutting people out before they get there. And you know, at the same time, you know, how do you maintain, you know, your, yeah, how do you keep the prestige, but also the educational attainment standards up, and at the same time address these questions? I think universities are, I don't know how much they're actually really grappling with it, or whether this is becoming aware, but like it really would require a major rethink. And I'd love to hear from Ken on this, a major rethink on how admissions processes are handled, and also how to handle the volume of that, and in a way that may, because, you know, every faculty member, I can't tell you how many applications people get in. There has to be some way to sift through these efficiently. Anyway, I'd love to hear from Ken more on that issue.
Holly, I can, thanks for asking about that. In fact, I can tell you there's been a major shift that's happened at Berkeley in the last year in terms of hiring and admitting and recruiting Black students. And this was triggered by the national events, and also by hiring an extraordinarily talented new faculty member who's originally from Ethiopia, who's actually co-founder of Black in AI. And she, Radiat Abebe, was just this powerhouse, and she educated, you know, really got everybody motivated. And so we dropped the GREs, which was a major step, because we didn't realize how much of a barrier that was and how discriminatory it was. And then we actively recruited. So we really made sure that we spent a lot of time on all the diversity candidates, and we called them, and we really spent time. And I'm happy to report that it worked very well. We have far surpassed any year in terms of admits and actually accepts for our PhD program. And the key now is to make it a really environment that will sustain and welcome and make them thrive, and then continue this for the next year and the year after and so on. Now, I think that I saw how much of a concerted, focused effort that took. And I think that exactly that same kind of mentality is going to be required for much broader definitions of diversity, and in terms of disability and class and a whole bunch of different factors and vector dimensions. So it's definitely something that that you're absolutely right. There has been a lot of hidden, I think, structural racism and structural barriers that we're just understanding now. And or I am understanding. I would say that I don't want to speak for others, but I really now see a lot more clearly than I did even a year ago. And I also want to say, though, it's in terms of hiring that we're trying to do it in terms of faculty, but it's been hard to bring people into labs and to research, you say undergrads, and also to hire in the company. And so, because we just don't have that big pool of applicants like you do, in, as you're mentioning, to the luxury of having those options. So I really appreciate the points you're making about creating having these stories, positive examples that will really set the tone, and also really being upfront and talking about all the factors that are of concern. I think that's exactly, those are really helpful, and I appreciate it. AnitaBorg.org is a great one, a great reference on and women in robotics. I think there's a lot of my colleagues that I think are just unclear. They just don't know how to proceed. And unfortunately, they exude a kind of bro culture that you're talking about, that, is a turnoff, I think, for a lot of candidates.
I think one of the elephant in the room frequently is this idea of meritocracy as a culture. saying that, well, we all have equal opportunities and we don't want to lower standards. And you pretty much scratch the surface of anything, and that comes out, and you have to fight that back at so many levels in so many stages and ways. But if you think about the person who's going to do a job successfully in the future, quite frequently there isn't even education right now for the qualities and the skills that that person is going to need in the future. We're going through such change. So the pattern matching that we do is flawed from the start. Perhaps excluding things that require 10 or more years of study to achieve. But for so much else, I mean, I've seen such change in robotics. These days, ROS is a critical skill to have. But we're heading towards no-code software at the same time. Having skill in robotics is not the only skill now. In fact, it's not necessarily a skill that you need in a robotics company, because robotics companies need to be market focused. So it's frequently more valuable for people to understand the domain in which robotics is. And this is certainly something that medical robotics companies have got a very good blending of people who are health practitioners, as well as people who are engineering. And there's a few more points. There are so many points there, but I'd like to pass the mic back around. Kerry, I know you've been developing an internship program. Do you have some reflections on that you'd like to share with us? And I think we really just have time for final reflections from the speakers. And I love, okay. And Ken, do you have a final reflection before you have to go and cook dinner? And extra points for cooking dinner, by the way.
Because I share their responsibilities with my wife. So I appreciate this conversation very much. And I appreciate, Andra, that you pulling this together. I know how much work it takes to organize and to find such great panelists and speakers. I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge. And I really think that if we could distill some of these best practices and recommendations into some kind of guidelines that we could share, because I know there's many people who aren't here today who would really, really appreciate and benefit. Maybe someone would write a Medium post or something, but I think that would be very valuable.
Yes, this is certainly, I want to pull the discussion today together into a format and pass it around the group again to give us a chance to add things that we might not have touched on and really make it available. And it makes me wonder, organizationally, are there ways in which we can be more proactive in some of these processes? But that's to be thought on as we continue this discussion. Thanks very much, Ken. Kerry, over to you.
Sure. So I think you wanted to hear about internships, and I think our company was in a sort of unique position. So we're a research-focused company, and previously most of our internships have been postdocs, which is not the traditional internship that a lot of companies are taking, right? So we were ending up with a very homogenous group of interns, and so recently one of the things that we've done is create an internship program for undergraduates as well, and of course that requires that we're committed to supporting them, right? That they can be successful, that they have an actual mentor throughout the entire process, that they're paid fairly, that we're giving them things to work on that are going to be useful to them, things that they can actually take through the rest of their career. And we have actually hired from some of these internships. So I think, we're learning from this experience too. What I think previously we thought required quite a lot more education to be successful here is just not what's true. And so that's really nice too. That helps us, build the case, right? Build a case for reducing some of the barriers to entry. So it's been a great experience.
That's really good to know. And I think it's very positive that you find that some of the skills that you thought, and some of the years of experience that you thought were essential, are not so. And I think that was a great point that you made right at the very start about, or perhaps Nicholas, about shorter job descriptions and fewer requirements being a fundamental way forward. I've also suggested that we look for gendered language that we don't realize is gendered. So there are services like Textio that can evaluate job posts and point out where language has these hidden meanings behind it. For example, if I see a rock star as a qualification, I tend to assume there's kind of a competitive bro culture that won't appreciate me. And it turns out that I'm not the only person that feels that way. So the way that we word our ads can lead us towards some candidates at the expense of others. And so it's very good to find that out. Nicholas, final reflections from you?
This is something that actually pops up in like my LinkedIn messages a lot too, is what skills do I need? What are people looking for? And a lot of people think that there's some special robotics skill that is the magic entryway into robotics. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do through like some of the Python meetups I do recently and all that, is to demystify that we're looking for just general engineers, marketing people, and things like that applied to a specific domain. Yeah, ROS is very good for instance, being a full stack roboticist and understanding how it all interacts. But at the end of the day, sometimes I just need a mechanical engineer who designs brackets, or an electrical engineer who's doing PCBs. Great example, like I myself only touched robots for the first time in my PhD. I went through a whole career of being a biomedical and mechanical engineer before even touching a robot. There's lots of non-traditional pathways that lead you to robotics, but having just a good solid foundation in project management and good engineering practice and things like that is the foundational skills. And it's all, once again, it's all about the outcomes. We don't necessarily need you to be the absolute best at ROS, but if you have a strong foundation in general software and architecture, you'll probably achieve the outcomes that we're looking for. Having experience with the tools is often a shortcut to that, but it's not an absolute requirement.
Having access to the tools is one of the biggest areas that can be a roadblock for people. In fact, Carlotta Berry from Black in Robotics talks about this, and has talked about this, where as an undergraduate, she was taught robotics, but she never got her hands on a robot. There just weren't enough to go around. And so she is both determined to get hands-on robotics for all her undergraduate students now, but just think about how many times that's replicated. If you don't get your hands on the particular tools that are coming up in requirements sections, then even if you've studied the subjects, you're not going to be able to compete. So access to tools is a really big one. Thank you for bringing that one up. And Hallie, final reflections from you.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the healthcare robotics thread. So I want to end on that note. A lot of us have heard of the quote, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." I'm not saying the future of inclusive robotics is in healthcare exactly, but I will say anecdotally that I do notice a lot of the healthcare robotics teams in the ones that I know, they're already practicing inclusive design methods because they have to, because they work with humans. and so I find there's already a great amount of awareness and inclusive mindset embedded in these teams. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do at the Robotics Institute, but I think we could all do more broadly, is see like who's already doing a good job of this and what can I learn from them. And that might be one area where we can learn from, and because I think it really is necessary to apply that mindset in order to actually make an effective product, service, or even a research project in those areas when you're working with people.
That's a great point, Hallie. Inclusivity by design requires inclusivity by company, by culture, from the very start. And there are great comments in the chat. If anybody wants to save the chat, I think I posted the quick how-to. It's taken me years to learn that, but we're finished for the evening. The video will be online in the Silicon Valley Robotics YouTube channel, but it might take me a while to get it edited with titles and on the YouTube channel. But thank you all for your participation tonight. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I'm going to be compiling the notes from tonight with notes from our recent Inclusive Robotics Unconference, and with some of the other documents. I know, Hallie, you've sent me some Canadian documents, and we'll work on putting together a paper on inclusive robotics. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and see you again.